The very first thing that Our Lady taught St. Bernadette was how to make the sign of the cross. So please join me in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And Bernadette herself would say, since you are so very, very good, we will all pray the Hail Mary together. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Lady of Lourdes, pray for us. Saint Bernadette, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, it's wonderful that you're all here. Somebody told me that my little teases at the end of Mass really got a lot of people interested. So I'm glad you're here. So I will tell you those stories and more as we begin on the 18 apparitions of St. Bernadette and Our Lady's teachings to Bernadette. Bernadette was a fascinating girl, and she became a very devout religious. She entered the Sisters of Charity and Christian Instruction in Nevers, France in 1866. And she spent the rest of her life at the convent in Nevers, and she never returned to Lourdes. And she's buried. Well, she was buried. She's now been exhumed, and her sarcophagus, her chasse, as the French call it, is on display because Bernadette's mortal remains are incorrupt. And if you've ever been to Nevers, France, she looks like Sleeping Beauty. So anyhow, if you ever get the opportunity, I do believe we have a photo of Bernadette too. I better get my clicker. Thank you. It works. So we're going back to Lourdes. We're going to take a trip together. So get in our time machine, and we're going to go back to the year 1843. It's January the 7th, and a little girl has just been born to Louise and Francois Hubertus. Louise had been born at Castro, and she was not the eldest daughter. And in the early part of the 19th century, the eldest daughter always married first in the family. And there were 5 girls in the Castro family, and Louise was the youngest. But Francois wasn't in love with Bernard, the oldest sister. He fell in love with Louise, and they broke tradition, and they got married. And on January the 7th, 1843, they gave birth to their first daughter, little Bernadette. Actually, she was baptized Mary Bernard, and she's named after the great Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. But her nickname for the rest of her life is Bernadette, and we call her today Saint Bernadette, although you may not know this, but when she was canonized in 1933, she was canonized as Saint Mary Bernard, an interesting little fact. So in 1843, Lourdes was kind of a backwater town in the south of France. It's in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains. And Francois was a miller. He would grind grain and corn to make grain flour or corn flour, as the case may be. And he was very good at what he did. And the Castro family were also millers. And Monsieur Castro had passed away, Louise's father. And when he married Louise, he took over the Castro mill. And he was very good at what he did. And he was a very popular young man. And a lot of people wanted to trade with him because he was very kind, he was very honest, and he was very generous. But then terrible things happened in France at that time. We're still recovering from the French Revolution. And then the Industrial Revolution was at its peak. And people were losing their jobs in droves. And so people were in great want. And to top everything else off, they had a terrible drought in the south of France. And the wheat fields were dying in the fields. The wheat was dying, there wasn't growing. It was a terrible time for everybody involved. And by the time Bernadette is 14 years of age, they are in dire straits. They had lost the Castro mill. They had been evicted because Louise was just as kind as her husband, Francois. And if they couldn't pay for flour, and if you didn't have flour, you would starve because the staple of the French diet is bread. And if they didn't have flour, they couldn't eat. So Louise would give out everything on credit, and she wouldn't collect her bills. And little by little, they began to lose everything. And they were left one mill and went to another, and then to another, and then to another. And then they were out on the street, and they were destitute. At this time, Bernadette's 14 years old. She has a younger sister and 2 little brothers. So there's 4 of them living at that time. A friend of the family had pity on them and said, well, I have a place where you can live, but it's not a very nice place. In fact, it was the former town jail, and it was so unhealthy that they even moved the prisoners out of it. And it was called the Cachot. And you can still visit the Cachot today. It's on the Rue de Petit Fossé in Lourdes. And that's where Bernadette was living at the time of the apparitions. Now, Bernadette, mother, could not nurse very well as a mother because she had burned herself in a terrible fire where a candle fell off the mantelpiece and burned her blouse and burned her breast. So she had a very difficult time nursing her babies. So she would send them out to a wet nurse. And Bernadette, the eldest, went out to a wet nurse by the name of Marie Locke. And so now Bernadette's 13 and a half, almost 14, and Louise meets Marie on the streets of Lourdes. And Marie knows how troubled the Subaru family is. In fact, Francois Subaru had just been arrested for stealing a piece of wood. He was completely innocent, but he was thrown in jail. And he was in jail for some time before it was discovered that he was not guilty, and the gendarmes set him free. But you know how people talk in a small town. And so they're all going to be whispering behind his back, oh, he's the one that was thrown in jail because he stole some lumber. And you know, I think he probably has a drinking problem too. So all of these things are going on in this small town. And the train decided not to go through Lourdes. So the economy of Lourdes is really going south. And Louise meets Marie on the streets of Lourdes one day. And Marie knows that they're in dire straits. They're living in this abandoned prison, and 6 people living in this tiny little room. Can you imagine? There's no outhouse. It's in the courtyard outside behind it. You can imagine what it looked like. Just imagine what it smelled like. That's where the Subaru family were living. So Marie says, you know, I could really use some help with the kids, and we have sheep, and Bernadette could serve as a shepherdess and help take care of the children besides. Oh, but Marie, my daughter, really wants to make her first Holy Communion. She's 14 years old and she hasn't made her first Holy Communion. And Marie says, well, I'll help her make her first Holy Communion. In those days, they had to memorize the catechism, and then you had to feed it back to you by rote. And Bernadette did not have a mind for memorization. She had a very difficult time. But the parish church was right across the street from the Locke farm. And she thought, what good fortune. They have a young curate there who will help prepare her to make her first Holy Communion. So Bernadette very happily goes to Bartres, which is 4 kilometers from Lourdes, to help Marie Locke raise her children and raise the sheep. And so off they went. But Marie didn't keep her part of the bargain. She wasn't very good in helping Bernadette with her catechism. And when she did help her with her catechism, all she would do was yell at her. And Bernadette wasn't learning anything. But the young priest took a shine to Bernadette. He realized that she was an exceptional young lady, and he wanted to help her as best he could to make her first Holy Communion, make her dream come true, to receive our Lord in the Holy Eucharist. But then he felt the call to a religious vocation, and he left that small little village and joined the Trappists. So they had a priestless parish. There was no one to take his place, and Bernadette could not make her first Holy Communion if there was no priest and there was no catechism. Try as she might, Marie wanted to teach her the catechism, but she couldn't. Bernadette couldn't memorize very well, and she got very angry with her, and it was a very difficult thing for her. So in the middle of the night, Bernadette got up and packed up all of her things and walked the 4 kilometers back to Lourdes. When they asked her why she didn't tell her parents how difficult things were there for her, she said, if the good Lord permits it, why should I complain? But she did return to Lourdes, and they're living at the Rue de Fossé in the abandoned prison. On the morning of February the 11th, 1858, Bernadette comes home from catechism class with her sister Toinette and their friend Jean Abadet. And Jean's nickname was Boilhomme. And Boilhomme was kind of one of these girls who was a know-it-all, and she was always the fastest and the toughest in the class. And she comes home with the Buharu sisters, and they're going to have something to eat, but there's no firewood. So Louise says to her daughters, I can't make anything to eat because we don't have any firewood. And Francois was out trying to find work, and he had a very difficult time finding work because nobody wanted to hire him because they thought he was a thief and a drunk. So Bernadette really was a girl from the wrong side of the tracks. So around 11:30 in the morning on February the 11th, they go out to collect firewood together. The three girls, Bernadette, Toinette, her sister, and Boilhomme. And they go down to the estate of Monsieur Lafitte because they understand that they had just downed some trees in that area and that there would be some small pieces of wood that they could collect and bring home for firewood. But before Louise gave her daughter permission to go, she made sure that she was wearing woolen stockings, and she made her put on sabots. Sabots are wooden shoes. Remember the Dutch had these wooden shoes? Well, that's what they were. And they were supposed to protect her feet from the cold, the damp, and the rain. And then she put a woolen shawl over her head. It was a kind of like a shawl veil, and it was called a capulet. And this one was white wool and had a navy blue trim all around it. And she sticks this on top of Bernadette's head, and she's complaining, of course, because she doesn't want to wear all this extra clothing. But it was winter, and she said, you've got to protect yourself, you're sickly. They had a cholera epidemic in Lourdes, and Bernadette contracted that disease. It didn't kill her, but it left her with asthma for the rest of her life. So she was a very severe asthmatic. So her mother wasn't going to take any chance that her daughter might get sick from going out to collect firewood. So here it is, 11:30, February the 11th. The three girls go down to the estate of Monsieur Lafitte, and they have to go by the town garbage dump. Now, that doesn't sound very attractive, does it? Think what it looks like. Think what it smells like. In addition to that, pigs were herded in the area. That sounds really gross to me, but that's the situation. And they went to a place called Massabielle. Massabielle in Bernadette's dialect literally means the old hump. And it was a massive piece of rock, and it formed a series of grottos and a little cave. There on one side of the river Gave, and the grotto of Massabielle is on the other side. And Toinette and Boilhomme decide they're going to cross the river at that point. There were several mills on this river, and they had the water level at its lowest. So it was very easy for them to cross the river. So they took off their shoes and they crossed to the other side, and the water was so cold that the girls began to scream. And Bernadette says, I want to join you. And the two girls said, no, Mama would kill us if she found out you went into this water. She said, you stay on that side and you wait for us. And Bernadette's sitting there grumbling to herself. She sits down on a rock and she starts to take off her wooden shoes, her sabots, and she takes off the woolen stockings. And then she looks up into the grotto of Massabielle. So you've got a little cave on the bottom and then a niche, a little grotto indentation into the rock. And Bernadette sees a vision of light. Now she's got one sock on, one sock off, one sabot on, one sabot off, and she's mesmerized by this vision, and she's taken up with a great deal of fear. What is this vision? She's never seen anything like it, and she's afraid. So she kneels down. She reaches into the pocket of her apron to take out her rosary beads. She can't raise her hand. She's so filled with fear. It was exactly noon on February the 11th, and the Angelus began to toll in the parish church. And even out in the countryside, they could hear it, and the faithful would pray, the angel of the Lord announced unto Mary, and she conceived by the Holy Spirit. And at that moment, the vision of light appears to Bernadette. Bernadette reaches into her pocket. She's paralyzed. She can't raise her hand. Then the vision of light takes the rosary that's in her hand, and she makes this magnificent sign of the cross. And then Bernadette finds she's able to raise her crucifix to her forehead, and she too makes the sign of the cross. And then the rosary commences. But the vision of light doesn't join Bernadette in the prayers. She doesn't say the Our Father. She doesn't say the Hail Mary. The only thing the vision joins in on is glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit. And they say that prayer together. Why don't you think the vision of light prayed the Our Father and the Hail Mary? Well, the Hail Mary is easy. Our Lady doesn't have any need to pray to herself. And the Our Father, give us this day our daily bread. She's already enjoying the vision of Almighty God. She doesn't need her daily bread. She has everything she needs in paradise. It is Bernadette who prays. And then Toinette and Jean Abade return, and they've got big bundles of firewood on their heads. They're carrying in the peasant tradition, and they see Bernadette. And Bernadette is somewhat in ecstasy, and she's kneeling there, and she's pale as a ghost, and she's on her knees. And Toinette says, I think she's dead. I think she's dead. And Boilhomme says, don't be stupid. She can't be dead if she's kneeling upright. And she said, oh, I guess you're right. So they picked up some stones and they threw them at her across the river, but nothing happened. And then Bernadette came to, and she heard the world around her once again. Antoinette and Jean Abade wanted to know exactly what had happened. Did you see something? No, I didn't see anything. Are you sure you didn't see something? Oh, Bernadette, you did see something. What did you see? I said, well, you promised me that you won't tell anybody, and especially don't tell Mom. And she began to tell them she saw a vision of light, and she was dressed in a white gown with a long white veil, just a little bit of hair coming out by the temples. She had a rosary in her arm, and she had 2 yellow roses on each one of her bare feet. Antoinette is just flabbergasted by this. Who would appear in the village garbage dump dressed like that and be barefoot in the middle of February? And so she promises the 2 girls, make her promise that they won't tell anything. Well, they go back home, and you know what happens. As soon as they walk in the door of the cachot, she tells, Mama, guess what Bernadette saw at Massabielle? And she said, what are you talking about? And then she told her what she had seen. And of course, Louise doesn't believe this at all. She believes it's just a fancy of the young girl. And she said, I never want to hear you speak about it again. And then this is Thursday, the 11th of February. On Sunday, February the 14th, Bernadette feels an interior pull to go to the grotto. She can't resist it. It's beyond her control. She feels that she must go back to Massabielle. So she goes to her mother, and she begs permission to go to the grotto. And her mother looks at her and says, no, I absolutely forbid it. I don't want you hanging out at the garbage dump. And she said, it's not a good place. It's not what holy thing would appear in a garbage dump? No, absolutely forbidden. And Bernadette persisted and persisted and persisted. Well, what does mother say? Go and ask your father. Well, Francois had gotten a job at the stable, grooming horses. That's where he was working that day. So Bernadette and her sister and their friend, and then they picked up a lot of little schoolgirls from her catechism class on the way to the stables to ask Papa's permission. And so they've got an entourage of about a dozen girls, and they go into the stables, and Bernadette asks permission to go to Massabielle. And of course, the father just shakes his head, no, 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 no. But Mama said we had to ask you. No, 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 no. But then Monsieur Cazenave, who's the stable master, he says, Francois, she's dressed in white, she's holding a rosary. Could it be something evil? Let the girl go. Well, Francois didn't say anything. Silence means consent. So they all decided to go back to Massabielle and see what was going on down there. But Bernadette had an inclination that she should bring holy water with her, because some of the wags in the town were saying, this isn't a holy thing, this is probably the devil himself. So Bernadette goes to the parish church. She takes a little bottle of water and she dips it in the holy water font and she fills it to the brim, puts a cork in it, and she runs down to the grotto. Jean Abadet, their friend Boilhomme, is really annoyed because Bernadette, who's always so sickly, ran like a young billy goat, and she was the first one to arrive at the grotto. And when Toinette gets there, Bernadette is already in ecstasy. And Bernadette takes the holy water and she sprinkles the vision of light. And you know what she said to her? If you're from God, you can stay. But if you're from the devil, you have to go away. And she continued sprinkling the holy water on the vision. What was the vision's reaction? She laughed. She thought this was very funny. And Bernadette said she only grew brighter and more beautiful. And Bernadette learned the most elegant gestures from imitating the vision. She would bow. She would curtsy. She became the most polite young woman in Lourdes because she was imitating what she had seen. And then the lady smiled her head, and at the end of praying the rosary, the vision of light disappears. Now, Louise is getting very upset with all of this because all the girls go home and they tell their families, they tell all their parents. The whole village of Lourdes knows what's going on at Massabielle, and Louise and Francois are mortified by this. And they say, no, you cannot go back. I absolutely forbid it, you cannot go back. Well, they're practically destitute. They have very little money come in. And to make some money, Louise does laundry for the women of Lourdes. And so she goes to a very wealthy woman by the name of Madame Millet. And Madame Millet hears about the vision of light, and she's very, very interested. And she says to Louise, certainly you're going to let Bernadette go back to the grotto, aren't you? Oh, no, I've forbidden her to go back. Oh, but I think that you should let her go back. And she said, no, all those giddy little schoolgirls, and they're spreading all these rumors around town. And then she looks at her and says, Louise, I am a very prominent member of the community, and if I go with her, nobody will dare laugh. I want to take her to the grotto myself. Well, how could she refuse Madame Millet because she was dependent on her to make some money by doing her laundry? So it's agreed that on Thursday, the 18th of February, Madame Millet and another young lady of the parish, Antoinette Perret, will go along with Bernadette to the grotto. So they attended Mass at 5 o'clock in the morning in their parish church, and then they went to the grotto. And Madame Millet is very interested in this vision of light because she really believes that the vision is her goddaughter who had died the year before. And her goddaughter, Elsie, was the president of the Children of Mary Sodality in the parish. And what did the Children of Mary wear when they went to their meetings? A long white gown, a long white veil, and a blue sash around their waist. And when they had their processions around the church, they would carry a rosary in their hands. So Madame Millet is convinced that this is the soul of her goddaughter Elsie coming from purgatory to ask for prayers. So she insists that Bernadette bring with her pen, ink, and paper to write down exactly what the vision wants. So they get to the place of the apparitions in front of Massabielle, and Madame Millet hands her the paper, the pen, and the ink. I mean, in those days, they didn't have big pens. You had to dip the pen in the inkwell and then write on the paper. So Bernadette looks at Madame Millet and Mademoiselle Perret, and she said, stay back. Well, this really upset Madame Millet because she had been the housekeeper for Monsieur Millet, and his wife had died, and she married him, and she became the wealthiest woman in Lourdes. Well, maybe Bernadette told her to step back because the vision of light doesn't think she's worthy to approach her. Maybe that's why she told her to get back. So all these thoughts are going through her mind. So Bernadette takes the paper and the ink and the pen, and she puts them on the rock in front of the vision of light, and she speaks for the first time. She smiles at her, and she says, it is not necessary for me to write down what I have to say. And then she says this to Bernadette, I cannot promise to make you happy in this world, but in the next. And then finally, a request. Would you be so kind to come here for a fortnight. She's asking her to come for a 2-week period every day. Bernadette, of course, is delighted with this. And Madame Millet says, "Can we come closer?" And she looks to the vision of light. The vision of light says there's no reason for them to stay behind. So they're coming up right with Bernadette, and they're kneeling down with her. Bernadette finishes the rosary, and the vision disappears. No idea who this is. No idea what she wants. All she knows is she has to go back for a 2-week period. On Friday, February the 19th, Bernadette goes to the grotto with her aunts. Madame Millet wanted her to come and live in her home, and she thought Bernadette is a poor, sickly child. She needs good meals, she needs good rest. I have this gorgeous home. And Bernadette spent one night there. And she got up in the morning and she went back to the cachot, the old abandoned prison, to live with her siblings and her parents because she felt that this would not please the vision. And Bernadette made a resolution that she would never accept anything from anyone because of this apparition. No money, nothing. So she leaves Madame Millet's home, which upsets Madame Millet, but Bernadette does not care about that. So she goes to the grotto without Madame Millet. This time, though, her mother and her aunts are with her. And her oldest aunt, Bernard, for whom she's named, said, "We need something blessed down there in that grotto." And she said to her younger sister, Lucille, "Go and get your blessed candle from home." Devout Catholics at the time always kept blessed candles at home in case the priest had to make a sick call or something. So she went home and she got her candle. And Bernadette lit the candle. And this is the origin of carrying candles and lighting them in front of the grotto. Bernadette says the rosary with the vision of light and nothing more. The vision vanishes. Saturday, the 20th of February, 1858, Bernadette goes to the grotto. The vision of light is already there. And Bernadette says something that's really astonishing. She said the vision was standing at the grotto, looking out at the crowd of people who had assembled there. And all of a sudden, she would look at someone, and she would recognize them and smile at them and bow. And Bernadette said it was as if she was recognizing her old and dear friends. And then she would begin the sign of the cross, and they would continue with the rosary, and the vision was over. On Sunday, the 21st of February, there is another vision. Bernadette had gone there on Saturday, the 22nd, but there was no apparition. And they don't know why there wasn't an apparition, but some of the people in the town said there were some ladies in the town snooping around, and they touched the wild rose bush, which the vision stood on top of, and that displeased her, so she did not come. But on Sunday, the 21st, she does come. The lady appeared to Bernadette very early in the morning. There were about 100 people present. Afterwards, the police commissioner, Jacomet, wants to see Bernadette, and he wants Bernadette to tell him everything she knows about this vision. Now, this is interesting because Bernadette does not know the name of the vision, doesn't know who the vision is, and she calls the vision ekero in her own dialect. That means that thing. So you can imagine, I see that thing in the niche of the rock. So she's being interrogated by the police commissioner. So, you see the Blessed Virgin Mary in the grotto of Massabielle? No, monsieur. I see ekero. I see that thing. Oh, so you're denying that you see the Blessed Virgin. She has not identified herself as the Blessed Virgin. I don't know who she is. So then she tells you that she wants you to do all kinds of things, and Bernadette said, no, she hasn't asked me to do anything except come for a 2-week period. And it goes on and on and on. And Jacomet makes up stories, and Bernadette says, no, monsieur, that is not true. Jean-Baptiste Estrade, who also worked in the town, was sitting in the room as Jacomet was interrogating Bernadette. And he could tell that Jacomet was becoming very exasperated because nothing that he would say to Bernadette could throw her. She remained calm, she remained peaceful, and she answered as truthfully as possible. And finally, there's a pounding at the door, It's Bernadette's father, Francois, and he says, "You'd better take care of this, or I'm going to put your daughter in jail." And he said, "Oh, Monsieur Jacomet, I want nothing but an end to this ordeal." And he says, "Well, take care of it, man, take care of it." And he leaves with Bernadette. And Jean-Baptiste Estrade looks at Jacomet, and Jacomet says, "Well, I took care of that." And Jean-Baptiste looks at him and says, "I think it was your very good fortune that the father showed up just when he did." So that was the end of her interrogation with the police commissioner. On Tuesday the 23rd, there are 150 people at the grotto, and the apparition reveals to Bernadette a secret that is for her alone. And in the course of the apparition, the vision will give her 3 secrets. We have no idea what they were. When asked about them, because everybody wanted to know, especially the Episcopal Commission that the bishop would call later on, Bernadette would never say. She said, "It's for me and for me alone." On Wednesday, the 24th of February, Bernadette goes to the grotto and she starts crawling on her knees. She bows and puts her head on the ground as far as she can. And when people saw her doing this, they imitated her doing this. And they asked her, "Why did you do this?" And she said, "Because the vision of light said, penance, penance, penance. Pray to God for sinners. Kiss the ground as an act of penance for sinners." Bernadette did it. The people imitated her. And every time she went to the apparition, Bernadette repeated that action. She would pray for poor sinners for the rest of her life. There's an interesting story about this, that a young aristocrat from Paris took the train down to Lourdes in the middle of the apparitions because he wanted to become famous by saying, "Bernadette's a fraud, she's a fake." Well, half of France was saying the same thing. So he goes down to France and he asks where he can find Bernadette Subaru. And they said, "Well, she's not at the grotto right now, so she's probably at home." So he went to the Cachot, the abandoned prison where her family were living, and Bernadette was sitting on the front stoop, doing, of all things, mending socks. And he's astounded by this. Here's this little girl mending socks. Now, Bernadette was 14 years of age, but people at the time said she looked more like she was 10 years old because her growth was so stunted. She was never taller than 4 foot 7 inches, if that. So you can imagine this little girl sitting on the front stoop and she's darning socks. And so this aristocrat, this young man, comes to prove that she's a fake. And he said, "If you really saw the Most Holy Virgin," and Bernadette says, "I didn't claim it was the Most Holy Virgin." He said, "Show me how she smiled at you." And she said, "Sir, you would have to be in heaven to see that smile." And he said, "You are a phony, you're a fake. You don't believe." "No, I don't." And then the light bulb clicked on Bernadette's brain. This man is a poor sinner. So Bernadette imitated the actions of the Blessed Virgin. She folded her hands in prayer and she looked up to heaven. And that young man saw the smile of the Blessed Virgin on Bernadette's face. And he was instantly converted to Our Lady of Lourdes. That's just one of the stories circulated about Bernadette. There was also a young woman by the name of Eugenie Trois, and Eugenie had lost her eyesight. She had terrible eye disease. And she went to Lourdes. She had one request. "I want to see the visionary. I want to see Bernadette." That's all she prayed for. So her family decided to take her to Lourdes. One of the apparitions had just finished. Eugenie and her family come into the village through the gate, and they're passing a large crowd, and it's Bernadette and her followers. And Bernadette sees this blind girl, and she goes over to her, and she starts to undo the blindfold because daylight is very painful to her. But she undoes the blindfold. And Toinette, the young woman, says that she looked into the eyes of a little girl, and this little girl kissed her on both cheeks, and her eyesight was completely restored. Now that made a great sensation in the town, but a few days later, her eyesight faded again. And people were saying, "See, this proves that Bernadette is a fraud. because the miracle wasn't lasting. But she didn't pray to keep her eyesight. Her only request was that she look into the face of the visionary of Lourdes, and she did. There was also a little boy outside the town whose last name was Piquet, and he had a terrible condition that they diagnosed as the failure to thrive. And he was starving to death, and his mouth would just hang open. And his mother was very distraught about this, and they were friends of the Subaru family. So they asked for Bernadette to come and pray with him. Well, Bernadette did it because they were family friends, and she went there, and she saw this young man, and she said it was just a pitiful sight, this little boy with his mouth hanging open, and you could see the little kid was starving. And said, Bernadette said, won't you eat something for me? And she couldn't understand what he was saying, and so the mother would translate for Bernadette, and she got him to eat a little bit more. First time he'd eaten in days. And then the mother said, Bernadette, you have to come more often because the only time he eats is when you come here. So Bernadette went several times. And by the end of this long ordeal, the little boy was healed. Very interesting. Bernadette would have other experiences of healing when she was a nun at Nevers, but we're getting ahead of herself. On Thursday, the 25th of February, Bernadette goes to the grotto. There were 300 people there. And Bernadette relates, she told me to go drink of the spring. I only found a little muddy water. So Bernadette initially gets up and she runs to the river Gave. And the vision of light says, no, not the river, there at the spring. Where? There's no spring there. And the vision points there, near the inside of the cave. And so Bernadette goes over there and she starts to dig with her hands. And finally, when she gets deep enough, there's a trickle of water coming up. And the lady says to her, wash yourself in the water of the spring. Drink of its water. Eat the wild herb that grows there. And pray for poor sinners. And so Bernadette did that. And she said, wash. So Bernadette took some of this muddy water and she washes it all over her face. And she begins to eat the weed that's growing there. And it's too much for her and she spits it out. And people are watching this and they're really disgusted. And they said, this girl's gone nuts. We don't want to imitate this. This is crazy. And a lot of people went away that day very, very disappointed. But after everybody left, that little bit of muddy water became a fountain of water, springing up and flowing out from the inside of the rock. And the spring had come forth. The vision said, go and wash there, drink of the water there, eat of the herb that grows there. And Bernadette would tell the people, it is for poor sinners. So pure water starts to gush out of this hole in the ground. And so people came and they built a basin around it, not the elaborate baths that we have today, but we do have a picture of the spring. That's the grotto as it appears today. There's the spring. There was a woman named Catherine Latapi who was a farmer's wife. She had 9 children. She was 6 months pregnant. She was gathering apples out of a tree when she fell out of the tree and hit her right arm, and her right arm and hand were paralyzed. She had to take care of her family. She had to run the farm with her husband. She's pregnant. What is she going to do if her right hand is paralyzed? So she's heard about this spring at the grotto, and they had made a little makeshift trough around it, and she goes in the middle of February, and she submerges her right arm in the water, and she pulls it out of the water, and all of a sudden she begins to move her arm. The paralyzed fingers are beginning to work, and she is the first healing from the spring of Lourdes. That was in 1858. On Saturday, the 27th of February, 800 people are present. The apparition was silent. Bernadette drank the water from the spring, and she performed her usual acts of penance. On Sunday, the 28th of February, there were over 1,000 people at the grotto, and Bernadette goes into ecstasy. She prayed, kissed the ground, and moved on her knees as a sign of penance. She was then taken to the house of Judge Reeves, who threatened to put her in prison. And you know what she said to him? Well, you better tie me up really tight because otherwise I'm going to escape. He interrogated her for a while, and then he finally let her go. On the 12th apparition occurs on Monday, the 1st of March. Over 1,500 people are assembled, and among them for the first time was a priest in a cassock. Father Paramount, who was the pastor of Lourdes and the head of the local deanery, had forbidden his faithful and his priests to go to the grotto. The faithful went. The priests were terrified of them, so they didn't go. But this priest did not belong to his deanery, and he went and witnessed the apparition. On Tuesday, the 2nd of March, the crowd becomes larger and larger, and the lady has a request for Bernadette. A caro, that thing in the rock. We still don't know its identity. This is the message. Go and tell the priest that people are to come here in procession. Build a chapel here. Bernadette goes to Father Paramount. Now, as I've just mentioned, he was the son of a doctor, and he was a very intimidating individual, and they were very much afraid of him. And Bernadette was afraid of him. But her aunt decided that she would take Bernadette to the rectory and they could discuss the vision with Father Paramount. Father Paramount is not buying any of it. He wants to know who is this vision, what is the vision's name? And he demands another test to see if the wild rose bush would bloom at the feet of the vision. It's February, it's the middle of winter. No roses bloom in Lourdes at that time of the year. Bernadette simply says, I will tell her. The 14th apparition occurs on Wednesday, the 3rd of March, 1858. From 7 o'clock in the morning, in the presence of 3,000 people, Bernadette arrived at the grotto, but the vision did not appear. After school, she heard the interior invitation to the lady. She went to the grotto and asked her again for her name. The response, a smile. The parish priest told her again, if the lady really wishes a chapel to be built, she must give her name, and she must make that rose bush bloom. On Thursday, the 4th of March, the ever greater crowd, about 8,000 people, are waiting for a miracle at the end of the fortnight. But the vision is silent. Father Paramount sticks to his guns. For 20 days, Bernadette does not go to the grotto, and she doesn't feel that irresistible urge to go to the grotto. And then, on the great feast of the Annunciation, Bernadette feels that interior urge to go to the grotto. She's hoping that she will make the wild rosebush bloom too, on which she stood. So, Bernadette asked the lady if she would be so kind as to give her name. This is all not in French. Bernadette doesn't speak French. She's speaking in their local dialect. And the vision is speaking with her in her local dialect. And the interesting thing is the vision uses the formal vous form, not the very informal tu form in French in her dialect. If you have to know French to understand this, but it's a person of great merit would be condescending to use like a child, a teacher with a child, you would use the tu form. But the vision of light uses the polite vous form. And Bernadette said it was the very first time in her life that I was treated as a person. So the vision of light gives Bernadette all due respect and honor. But she doesn't give her name. Bernadette asks a second time, would you be so kind as to tell me your name? More smiles, no answer. A third time, please have the grace to tell me your name. More bows, more smiles. The vision grows brighter, but there's no answer. Bernadette's really getting exasperated because she knows that nothing good is going to come of this if she doesn't know who she's talking to. So finally she says, the fourth time, would you be so kind as to tell me who you are? And then the vision of light looks at Bernadette, and she smiles, and she takes her hands and she puts them together, palm to palm. She raises them up and she looks to the heavens and she says to Bernadette in her own language, Que soit era Immaculata Conceptio. I am the Immaculate Conception. Bernadette has no idea what that means. So she keeps repeating it to herself. I am the Immaculate Conception. I am the Immaculate Conception. So her mother, her aunts, they're coming to her. What's the vision's name? Bernadette can only say, I am the Immaculate Conception. She was afraid she was going to forget it. So she keeps repeating it as she's running. And she's running to the rectory in Lourdes. I am the Immaculate Conception. All the little girls are running up to her. What's her name? What's her name? I am the Immaculate Conception. I am the Immaculate Conception. I am the Immaculate Conception. She bursts into the rectory. Father Paramount is sitting at his desk. He sees her come in unannounced. She jumps in front of him. She puts her hands out like this and she shouts at the top of her lungs, I am the Immaculate Conception. Father Paramount said at that moment he felt he had been struck by lightning. And for the very first time, he believed Bernadette's Hubertus. I am the Immaculate Conception. Bernadette didn't even know what it meant. And only in 1854 did Pope Blessed Pius IX declare this truth as a dogma of faith, that from the very first moment of her conception, Mary was conceived without sin. So now we have the answer. Go and tell the priests that I want a procession to come here, that I want a chapel to be built here. Now, it's very interesting when she says, go and tell the priests. Father Paramount wasn't impressed. He said, even the pagans have priests. We are Catholics. But the French clergy during the French Revolution had to go underground. They were hunted down and killed. And they had those who took the oath of allegiance to the French government and those who refused. Because if you took the oath of allegiance to the French government, you were getting rid of Rome and the Holy Father. They were creating their own French church. And a lot of the faithful were courageous and refused to do so. Many were put to death during the Revolution. The priests of the Deanery of Lourdes never took the oath of allegiance to the civil constitution. They were the non-juring clergy. Maybe this was a salute to them, an honor to them, that the Immaculate Conception comes to them. I desire that people come here in procession, build a chapel. What happens when you build a chapel? You celebrate Holy Mass. The Holy Eucharist is celebrated there, and the faithful come in procession. How many of the miracles of Lourdes occurred in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament? The 17th apparition occurs on the 7th of February, 1858. During this apparition, Bernadette had to keep her candle alight. It's very windy. The flame licked along her hand without burning it. A medical doctor, Dr. Duzou, immediately witnessed this fact. Bernadette seemed to be even more absorbed than usual in the apparition. I witnessed, as I did, and everyone there present, the fact of what I'm about to say. She was on her knees saying with fervent devotion the rosary. When she held in her left hand, while in her right was the large blessed candle, a light. The child was just beginning to make the usual ascent on her knee, when suddenly she stopped, and her right hand joining her left, the flame of the big candle passed between her fingers, and though fanned by a fairly strong breeze, the flame produced no effect on the skin to which it was touching. Astonished at this fact, I forbade anyone there to interfere. Taking my watch in hand, I studied the phenomenon attentively for a quarter of an hour. At the end of this time, Bernadette, still in ecstasy, advanced to the upper part of the grotto. Separating her hands, the flames ceased to touch her left hand. Bernadette finished her prayer, and the splendor of transfiguration left her face. She rose and was about to leave the grotto when I asked her to show me her left hand. I examined it carefully, but could not find the least trace of burning anywhere upon it. Then I asked the person who was holding the candle to light it again and to give it to me. I put it several times in succession under Bernadette's left hand, but she threw her hand away quickly, saying, "Are you trying to burn me?" I record this fact just as I have seen it without attempting to explain it. Many persons who were present at the time can confirm what I have said. Well, Dr. Pierre Dezou became a believer on that day. The final apparition occurs on the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. It's July 16th, 1858. The local authorities had succeeded in having the grotto barricaded. There was a fence all the way around it. You couldn't get near it. Bernadette receives the mysterious call to go to the grotto, but her way was blocked and closed off by a barrier. She arrived on the other side of the River God, and she said, I felt that I was in front of the grotto at the very same distance as before. I saw only the Blessed Virgin, and she was more beautiful than ever. That was the last of the apparitions on the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, July 16th, 1858. Already dozens of people are being healed after bathing in the water that came forth at the command of the Virgin. And the grotto is barricaded. Nobody is supposed to be able to use the water from the grotto. It's contraband at this point. You'll be arrested if you go behind the barrier and try to take some. Well, the French Emperor Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, was vacationing with the Empress Eugenie in Biarritz, which isn't very far away from Lourdes. It's a seaside resort. And the Crown Prince Imperial is deathly ill. He has a very high fever. Eugenie is a very devout Catholic. Louis, not so much. But she wants to get water from Lourdes. And she knows that her lady-in-waiting, the wife of Admiral Buharu, had gone to Lourdes to get some water. In fact, she was arrested and had to pay the fine like a common thief. But she did. And she goes to her lady-in-waiting and she said, give me some of this Lourdes water so I can give it to the Prince Imperial. And she said, but Your Highness, I drank it all. I don't have any left. And she said, what am I to do? The Crown Prince is going to die. And she said, but I do have some of the weed, the grass that was growing at the spring. And the Virgin told Bernadette to eat of the grass. And she said, I was able to pick some of that. I have that. But it's all dried out now. She said, nonetheless, bring it to me. So the Empress Eugenie ground it down with a mortar and pestle. It just fell apart. She made a little dust out of it, powder, made a tea out of it, gave it to the Prince Imperial, and immediately his fever left him. So the Empress, who was renowned to be one of the most beautiful women in all of Europe, calls in her hairdressers. She has her ladies-in-waiting do her makeup. She puts on her finest gown and her most beautiful tiara, and she walks into the presence of the Emperor Louis Napoleon, and she says to him, Louis? And he looks at her, and his eyes just bug out of his head. He says, yes, darling, anything you want. She said, I want the grotto at Massabielle to be reopened to the public. Oh, but I can't do that. You owe the life of your son to the Virgin of Massabielle. You must do this. So by imperial decree, the barricades were removed, and the faithful could go to the grotto and get the water once more. In 1858, there were at least 10 healings at the grotto. I told you about Catherine Latapie, and then if you've seen the movie, The Song of Bernadette, you've heard about Louis Bourriette. In the movie, Louis Bourriette says that he's carving a statue of the Blessed Virgin and a piece of marble hits him in the eye and he goes blind. That's not what happened. He and his brother were coal miners and they were working in a mine near Lourdes and there was an explosion. His brother was killed. A piece of shrapnel went into Louis's eye and blinded him. He goes to the grotto. He takes the water from the grotto and bathes his eye in it, and his eyesight is restored. He goes to Dr. Dezou. Dr. Dezou credits this as a miraculous healing. And then there's Justin Buharu. Justin Buharu was a friend of the Subaru family. He was only 2 years old at the time, and he also had the failure to thrive. They think he may have also had tuberculosis, but that hadn't been diagnosed at that time, and he was languishing and at the point of death. His mother, Quasine, cannot bear to see her little boy die. So she picks him up in the middle of the night, and she runs to the grotto of Massabielle. Now, the water of Massabielle is freezing cold, and come on, it's February, it's the middle of winter. She puts the child in the water, and she says, either take him or give him back to me. And she takes the child out of the water and brings him home. He wakes up the next morning and he is completely healed. Justin Buharu attends the canonization of Bernadette in Rome in the year 1933. Probably, and I'll tell you a secret, you don't have to go to Lourdes to experience the grace of Lourdes. You invoke the intercession of the Blessed Virgin, even if it's simply by saying the word Lourdes, and invoke the intercession of Our Lady. Pierre de Roudet was a Belgian, and he worked on an estate of an aristocrat, and he was cutting down a tree, and he took the axe and he missed the tree and he embedded the axe in his leg. It was a horrible accident. He was lame from that point on. The doctors wanted to amputate. He refused amputation. And he said, I can't go through life with only one leg. I have to support my family. I have to take care of them. What can I do? He couldn't afford the trip to Lourdes. He was in too much pain. For months and months and months this went on. The wound kept oozing blood and pus. And finally he decided he would make a pilgrimage to a town in Belgium that had a replica of the Lourdes grotto. And so he goes to this grotto. It's not Lourdes, it's in Belgium. But he goes there and he prays fervently. And he reminds the Blessed Virgin that just as she had to take care of the Holy Family, he has to take care of his family. But won't she please restore him to health? He walks around the grotto on his crutches 3 times, each time invoking, Our Lady of Lourdes, pray for us. At the 3rd time, he feels a sensation of warmth and hunger. He feels a surge go through his body, and his leg is completely healed. The wound is gone. The bones have mended themselves. My most famous encounter with one of the Miraculae at Lourdes occurred in the mid-1990s when I had gone on pilgrimage with Father Daniel, and we had gone to Lourdes with the hope of bringing a pilgrimage group there. And it was our last day, and Father Daniel wanted to go into the town to get something, and I wanted to go pray at the grotto again. And just before we had left, we had seen, I can't think of the name of the TV show, The Strangest American Happenings. I can't remember the name of it, but they interviewed people who had done and experienced marvelous things. And so they interviewed Jean Fratel. She's the 45th Miraculae of Lourdes. The people who were healed are called the Miraculae. And they interviewed her. She told her story. And they had her on television. So I saw who this woman was. So I'm standing in front of the grotto, and there's a procession of children who have various ailments. They're all in wheelchairs or on gurneys. And there are a group of adults with them. And there was one woman who was walking with them, and I recognized her immediately. This was Jean Fratel. She was in her 80s at the time. And I'm standing there like this, praying before the grotto, and she made a beeline for me. And she said, "Are you a Carmelite?" And I said, "Oui, madame, I'm a Carmelite." And she said, "Do you love Our Lady?" And I said, "Yes, I love Our Lady." She said, "Do you pray the rosary?" I said, "Oui, madame, I pray the rosary every day." This whole conversation was in French. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you preach about Our Lady to the faithful?" And I said, "Yes, madame, every chance I get." And she said, "Well, since you love Our Lady, since you pray the rosary, and since you preach about Our Lady, I, Jean Fratel, will pray for all those to whom you preach. Tell them that I, the Immaculate of Lourdes, am praying for them." I heard years later that Jean Fratel had passed away. She was well into her 90s. But now you know that she is praying for you before the very throne of God. I told you on one of the Sundays that Bernadette went to the grotto and she raised her rosary beads on high. And everybody thought that Bernadette was blessing rosaries that day, or that the Virgin was blessing rosaries that day. So afterwards, they went to Bernadette and they said, "Can you tell us what happened? Did you bless rosaries?" And Bernadette just laughed out loud and she said, "Do I wear a stole that I would bless rosaries?" And they laughed. And she said, "This is what happened. Before the apparition, my friend Pauline wanted me to take her beautiful rosary with me to the grotto. Pauline couldn't be there that day. She was sick in bed. She had a beautiful crystal and silver rosary, and she gave it to Bernadette, and she said, please use it during the apparition. So Bernadette put it in the pocket of her apron, and the apparition began, and she began to pray her rosary, and then the apparition was interrupted for some reason. So she puts her hand back in her apron pocket, and she takes out Pauline's beautiful crystal and silver rosary, and she's praying along with the Virgin, and she stops, and she looks at Bernadette, and she said, where is your rosary? And Bernadette holds up Pauline's beautiful crystal and silver rosary, and the vision says, that is not your rosary. So Bernadette puts the beautiful, rich rosary back in her pocket, takes out her very simple rosary made out of wood and cord, holds it up, and the vision of light says, make good use of it. And so there you have the story of why Bernadette is said to have blessed the rosaries. So also at this time, people are very anxious about Bernadette, and really they want to get rid of her, especially the authorities in the town. And so they send a group of psychiatrists to examine Bernadette. Now, I've told you that the grotto was already reopened by edict of the Emperor Louis Napoleon. And Bernadette is in the cachot, and a group of men come to take Bernadette away and examine her. And they do give her an examination. The verdict, she has this disease, but it doesn't affect her well-being. So what does that mean? It's just nonsense. Father Paramount decides that he has to do something, or they're going to kidnap Bernadette and put her in an insane asylum and get her out of the way. So he makes arrangements for her to go and live as a postulant with the Sisters of Charity and Christian Instruction in Lourdes. And that hospice, that school, is still there today. You can visit it and pray in the chapel there. And Bernadette lived there until 1866. And then she arrived in Lourdes on the 4th of July, 1866. And the entire congregation of Sisters of Charity, who were at the Mother House at that time, came out to see the visionary from Lourdes who was entering as a novice. And so the carriage comes out, and Bernadette steps out of the carriage with the other sisters who are with her. Bernadette's only this tall, and she has an umbrella, a little carpet bag, a little suitcase, a valise. And she gets out of the carriage, and one of the postulants says, "Is that her?" And Bernadette said, "That's all there is." And she entered there. And then the Mother Superior, Mother Josephine Imbert, made Bernadette go into the conference room, the chapter room as they called it. The entire convent was there. There were over 300 nuns in this room. And she told her to tell the story of the visions. She told them everything that had happened to the best of her recollection. And then she places her under holy obedience, never to speak about the visions again. That was very difficult for Bernadette, but she was obedient. And then it came time for her profession, and all the nuns were given an envelope, and it had their assignment in it. When it comes to Bernadette, her assignment is blank, and the bishop is standing in front of her, and he says, "What does it say, child?" And she said, "There's nothing written on it, Your Excellency." And Mother Josephine said, "That's because she's good for nothing." Bernadette accepted this in humility, because if the Lord permits it, who are we to complain? And then the bishop said, "Well, you know how to peel carrots. You certainly know how to ring bells." So he said, "You will work in the kitchen." And then from the kitchen, she gradually began to work in the infirmary, taking care of the dying and the sick sisters. And it was in that very infirmary that she died on April the 16th, 1879. Bernadette was 39 years of age. Her last words, "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for me, poor sinner, poor sinner." And the song of Bernadette has been told ever since. How many of you have seen the movie The Song of Bernadette? You know who wrote that? A German Jew by the name of Franz Werfel. In the early 1940s, Franz and his family escaped from Austria because they were being hunted by the Nazis. He was a noted journalist and author, and he took refuge in Lourdes. And he promised Our Lady of Lourdes and St. Bernadette that if he could get out of there and safely immigrate to the United States with his family, that he would tell the story of Bernadette. He did escape Lourdes, made his way to New York City, and he wrote the novel The Song of Bernadette, which was made into a movie in 1943 with Jennifer Jones, and it won the Academy Award. So now you know the rest of the story. So this is the miraculous spring. This is the grotto as it appears. Bernadette didn't like any of the images of Our Lady of Lourdes. How can you depict the beauty of heaven in a statue? Bernadette didn't like any of the statues. This is Bernadette. The photographer asked her to pose in ecstasy, just like she did during the apparition. And she said, there's only one problem. I don't have the Blessed Virgin in front of me. But she did pose for that image, praying her rosary, wearing the same clothes that she wore at the apparition. On the right, we have a picture of Bernadette dressed in the habit of her order, the Sisters of Charity and Christian Instruction. In the center of the processional area at Lourdes is the statue of the crowned Virgin. And the tradition is that if you leave flowers before the crowned Virgin, you will surely go back to Lourdes. This is the grotto as it appears today. There's somebody in that picture on the right that you might recognize. I got there was another priest designated to be the celebrant for the Mass, and we began the procession to walk out to celebrate Mass in English, and the celebrant looked at me and said, would you mind reading the gospel and preaching? I did. This is the altar of the Immaculate Conception in Lourdes, and I chose this picture. It's very interesting. You can't see it very well, but I have a friend who was a widower. His wife had died, and their son had died when he was 16 years old. Tragic life this poor man had. And he made a pilgrimage to Lourdes, and he's just beside himself with grief. And he's praying on his knees in front of this altar. And Our Lady is looking up into heaven to glory. And he prayed to her. And he said, please take away my grief. Take away my pain. And he looked up at the image of Our Lady. She was no longer looking up to heaven. She was looking directly at him. And all of his grief left him at that moment. This is the procession of the sick. This is just the beginning of the procession with the servers and the deacons. This is the sick going up to the grotto in the gurneys and the wheelchairs. This is inside the cachot. This tiny little room on the Rue de Petit Fossé is where the Subaru family lived during the period of the apparitions. So they had 6 people living in this tiny little room. This is in the parish church at Lourdes. This is the Baptismal Pond where Bernadette was baptized, Marie Bernard. It's still there. They still use it for baptisms. Okay, this is an interesting story. Bernadette didn't like any of the images of the Blessed Virgin. So she's at the Mother House in Nevers, and Mother Josephine Nevers, the General Superior, is really upset with her. How could she not like any images of the Blessed Virgin? So she had received as a gift from the Bishop of Nevers a book of old masters with paintings of Our Lady in it. And she said, you look at this book and see if you can find an image that you like. So Bernadette, out of obedience, opens the book and she starts paging through it, and she's paging through it. Mother Josephine loses her stream of thought. She's writing a letter. She turns around about 15 minutes later, and Bernadette is on her knees, practically in ecstasy. This is the image that she was looking at. What is in this image that would attract the attention of Bernadette? Bernadette said, I want that image placed at Lourdes. It wasn't until a few years ago when they built the very modern church of St. Bernadette, which is across the River Gave, and this icon of Cambrai is placed in it. This is one of the icons attributed to St. Luke the Evangelist, who knew Mary personally. What attracted Bernadette to this picture? Maybe it's the look of love and kindness in her face. This is one of the divine tenderness icons. Bernadette did like one other statue at the Mother House grounds, called Our Lady of the Waters. And the reason that she liked it was because Our Lady was smiling in the picture. And when they exhumed Bernadette's body for the process of beatification and canonization, she was found to be completely incorrupt. And so she was placed in a new habit, she was reburied, and then they took her and they placed her in the Mother House Chapel. And so this is what they call the Chas. This is her tomb, and that is the actual body of Saint Bernadette Subaru. That's a close-up of her face and hands. So she was beatified in 1921 by Pope Pius XI and canonized by the same Pope on the 8th of December 1933. Her feast day is celebrated on April the 16th in France and Canada. In France and Canada it's celebrated on February the 18th. Why do you think they celebrated on February the 18th? Because that's the very first time that the vision of light spoke to Bernadette. So the world celebrates her feast on